Hello again, and welcome to the third module of the Azure Fundamentals training course. Modules 1 and 2 of this course covered on knowledge transfer, where we explained the concepts and technologies you need to know about to pass the Azure exam. In this module, we're going to focus on getting you ready for the exam, and that means transferring that knowledge you have into real-world experience. Our preparation strategy for this exam is very much focused around giving you hands-on experience, and we do that through a series of 3 lab exercises. Those lab exercises are going to take you through deploying and configuring some of the solutions in Azure that you need to be very familiar with to pass the exam. We're then going to take a look at the AZ-900 exam structure and the contents that's in that, just to solidify so you know what you're up against with this exam. We're going to take a look at some time-proven exam tricks and tips that have gotten me and several other engineers through Microsoft exams over the years. We're going to take a look at the types and styles of questions that you can expect in the exam. And then finally, I'm going to show you where the exam preparation materials are so you can get a hold of the lab exercises, some readiness review questions, and the training notes. In today's first lesson, we're going to take a look at an exam preparation strategy. The idea here is, how do we take somebody who's come from no experience of Azure or very little experience of Azure, has attended this course and gained some knowledge, solidify that stuff and get you ready to sit and pass that exam comfortably. Now, I appreciate there may be people who have more experience, so people who are a bit more experienced, feel free to use your own judgment in creating your own exam preparation strategy. But if you're coming at this green, here's how I recommend you go about this. Personally, I'm a huge fan of the book, The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu was a very proven and experienced warrior who became a general. One of the principles that Sun Tzu exacts in The Art of War is, if you know the enemy as you know yourself, you need not fear the outcome of 1,000 battles. What Sun Tzu is trying to say is, if you know what you're getting yourself into, you can prepare for it, and you can pretty much guarantee your success by preparation. So, how do we prepare for this exam? First of all, we need to know the subject. What we've done in modules 1 and 2 is to explain the concepts to you. Now what we're going to do in this module is show you how to understand the subject. It's really important when you get into the exam that you feel like you understand the exam experience, and also that you feel like you understand Azure as a subject. If you go into this exam not feeling confident, you might wind up second guessing yourself. You might wind up panicking in the exam, and that's not going to help anybody. So to help get ready for this exam as well, we want to help you know the exam. How are we going to do that? Okay, start off. Once you've completed this course, once you've sat down and listened to the videos, go online to Microsoft's website, look at the exam page for the AZ-900 exam. If you Google AZ-900, you will find exam. You'll find probably in the first 4 or 5 results will be the official Microsoft page for the exam. On there, it'll go through the exam subjects that you need to know. They are documented in the previous modules of this course, and we will talk about them again throughout this module. But go online and look at that web page. It's important you look at that web page because it does change. Microsoft do adapt this technology as the Azure technology adapts. So as I'm recording this course in July 2019, the robot overlords haven't risen up and taken over yet. Azure hasn't become omnipotent and taken over the world. So in the future, there may be things that might change. That might change Azure quite drastically. So be ready and be aware for that. Before you sit the exam, go and have a look at those exam objectives and see if there have been any changes. Maybe there's a new technology that's come out that's gone in there. So unfortunately, I can't teach you foresight that I don't already have. Next, I want you to review the exam structure. We'll talk about this in one of the lessons today. We'll help you know what you're up against. Thirdly, get hands-on. In this module, we're going to prescribe some labs that you need to go and do. Getting hands-on experience with Azure is important, if not just from a knowledge perspective, from a confidence perspective. Personally, I find it very difficult to solidify concepts until I've had a hands-on play with it and made it work, break it, and fix it again. Revision notes. As I've gone through this course, I've created a set of revision notes. I'm going to publish those on the Azure team site. Also as well, if you created your own revision notes, go back and compare them against mine. Also as well, have a think about making your own revision notes. Once you've got some hands-on experience, there's no harm in going away and actually writing stuff down again just to help memorize it. Quite often, I find if I want to memorize something, I just write it down, and that'll help solidify it into my brain for long-term memory. Exam readiness. There are a series of tests that Microsoft make available through a firm called MeasureUp. MeasureUp are a Microsoft certified practice test provider. What this means is if you buy one of the MeasureUp tests and go through their materials, you'll get a simulation of the final exam experience that very closely meets the look and feel of the exam. The structure and the content of the questions are in there, match the exam's objectives. So if you go get the MeasureUp tests and have a run through them, that'll give you a feel for how well prepared you are for the exam. Now, the MeasureUp tests won't give you the exact same questions and answer combinations that you would find in the real exam. This isn't about a brain dump. Yeah. What this is about, though, is testing your knowledge of the same subjects that come up in the exam, the same topics, using the same styles and approaches of questions. When you can answer the MeasureUp and readiness review questions confidently and score at about 75% higher in the MeasureUp tests, you're more than ready to go away and sit the AZ-900 exam for real. So my advice is get out there, go through this preparation strategy, spend some time getting ready for this stuff. Then get in there and sit the exam. Don't worry about failing the exam. Failure is a really important part of learning. Microsoft themselves acknowledge this. When they sell you the exams, you can buy the exams with a free retake. In fact, in some cases, some of the exams allow for packages where you can have up to 3 or 4 retakes on the exam. The idea is if you go away and you sit that exam and you fail the first time, it's not game over. Come back, work through this preparation strategy again, figure out what you were weak on, focus on those areas and go back and have a go at it again. I don't know many people who passed their first Microsoft exam the first time. I know very, very experienced engineers working for Microsoft in the product groups who've had to sit these exams several times in the past. So part of this is about persistence and determination. Lesson 2 covers the briefing for the first set of lab exercises you should follow through to get ready for the Azure exam. Let's take a look at the first lab exercise and what I want you to be able to do in this lab exercise. So when I've designed each of the labs, I've built it around the knowledge that you need to have and the experience you need to have to be able to thrive in these exams. So the subjects that we're going to harden your knowledge on in this lab are creating and using an Azure AD tenant, creating and using an Azure subscription, getting an understanding of the Azure marketplace, creating virtual networks, creating virtual machines, to give you an understanding of public IP addresses and how they differ from private IP addresses, network security groups, VPN gateways, and load balancers. So what I've done is I've produced a set of guidance. If you take a look later on in this document, I'll point you to the location in Teams where the lab briefing document exists. When you go into that document, it's going to contain a set of step-by-step instructions. Because of the way Azure works, where the configuration and the layout of the portal changes and technologies change very, very quickly, those documents contain hyperlinks to online documentation. The online documentation gives you step-by-step granular instructions on what buttons to click, what to do, and what to expect in the environment. So, in the first lab, I'm going to get you to do the following things. If you haven't done so already, create yourself a trial subscription and a trial tenant. Now, a little bit of a heads up for people out there. You may have previously had an MSDN subscription, or you may have previously had something like an Azure trial subscription elsewhere. Don't worry, you can still get another one. Trial subscriptions are associated with a live ID account. So if you come along and create a brand new live ID account, it doesn't matter if your name matches one that's already been used, as long as it's a unique Microsoft ID account. And this is why we get you to create an Outlook.com mail account or a Hotmail type account to build that subscription against. Then once you've done that, we're going to go in there and we're going to create some very simple building blocks like a resource group. Yeah. We're then going to go and create some Azure resources. The labs will have you create a virtual network in Azure. We'll divide that virtual network up into multiple subnets. We're then going to deploy 2 virtual machines in an availability set onto that network. We're then going to look at creating a second virtual network and joining the 2 virtual networks together using a VNet VPN. Normally in Azure, when we would create a VNet to VNet VPN, that's something we would create between tenants. Yeah. The reason why I want you to get used to creating a VNet to VNet connection is because I want you guys to have a really solid understanding of the Azure Virtual Network's VPN gateways. Because a VPN gateway is what you would use to connect to on-premises resources using a site-to-site VPN. Now, obviously, you don't all have your own routers, you don't have your own servers on-prem. So the easiest way to simulate connecting 2 networks together using a VPN gateway in Azure is to create 2 networks in Azure and join them together using a VPN gateway. An alternative to using a VPN gateway in the real world would be to use VPN peering. The reason why I don't want you to create the VPN peering is because it's a simpler configuration. By all means, have a play with one and create one. But what I want you to be familiar with is creating a VPN gateway, because that comes up very frequently in the exams, because that's the key way of connecting to an on-prem network. Then what we're going to do is we're going to deploy a very simple website to our virtual machines running on Internet Information Services. We're going to create an external load balancer with a public IP address. We're going to configure that load balancer to send internet traffic and balance it out between those 2 virtual machines. And then finally, to complete this lab, we're then going to create some network security groups. So there you're going to learn how to create network security groups and apply them to individual network cards and to network subnets. What that means is you can use the very basic control of a network security group to lock down what traffic can flow into your virtual machine and across your virtual subnets. In lesson 3, I'm going to give you an overview of the exercises you're going to follow in lab number 2. Lab 2 is focused on giving you some hands-on experience and some deeper understanding of some of the concepts that sit behind Azure governance. What that means is, what are the things that you're going to put in place to control and maintain your Azure environment? So, in the exam, you need to know about things like Azure Active Directory, role-based access controls, resource groups, locks, resource tags, multi-factor authentication, Azure policies, Azure initiatives, and Azure administrative roles. The whole idea here is to give you some hands-on experience actually doing these things so you can conceptualize how these technologies and concepts work within Azure. So, during lab number 2, you're going to undertake the following activities. First of all, you're going to use that trial account that you created in lab number 1. You're going to go into Azure AD and you're going to create some Azure AD user accounts. Those user accounts are then going to become administrators for your Azure organization. Then we're going to create some resource groups in Azure, and we're going to be able to use Azure role-based access controls to delegate administrative rights to those users so they can have a specific and granular admin rights to the resources in a particular resource group. So what you're going to learn there is how to delegate control over particular resources to administrators and engineers who aren't necessarily going to own the entire Azure environment. Then we're going to create some resource tags and apply them to a resource group. And we're going to see then that the tags we apply to an entire resource group can be propagated to the objects that live within the resource group. We're then going to use Azure locks to prevent accidental deletion and accidental changes of Azure resources. We're then going to configure that an account requires to use multi-factor authentication to log into the Azure portal. It's a very, very powerful bit of functionality, but actually quite simple to set up. It's important to have some experience to conceptualize what multi-factor authentication is, what the options are for the administrators, and what the multi-factor authentication login experience looks like. And that's what you're going to do in this lab. Then finally, towards the end of the lab, I'm going to have you create a series of Azure policies and initiatives and apply them to not only the subscription level, but also to some resource groups. So you can see how we can implement controls and ways of reducing cost and ways of ensuring that best practice is followed throughout your Azure subscription. And you're going to be able to do that granularly, so you can target policies at an individual resource group that maybe only applies to one project team or one service. You're also going to be able to apply them at the subscription level so they apply to everybody in every resource in Azure. In lesson 4, we're going to cover the lab briefing for the third set of labs. Lab number 3 is focused around giving you some hands-on experience developing platform as a service options. It's quite important to have an appreciation of what the various platform as a service offerings are within Azure and how they underpin application developers to be able to deploy and host applications without having to maintain complex infrastructure. Unfortunately, as an Azure administrator, and even just as somebody who is certified with Azure Fundamentals, you're going to have to be able to understand how these concepts work. And the best way to do that is to do these labs, build it, and that'll help you conceptualize what's actually going on here. For the AZ-900 exam, you need to be knowledgeable about storage accounts, table, blob, file, and queue storage containers, content delivery networks. You need to be aware of SQL Server Platform as a Service, or Azure SQL as it's sometimes called, Cosmos DB as a Platform as a Service offering, and finally, Azure Solutions, which are basically pre-written templates that have an entire solution in them that you can just take and deploy. And we're going to use the Azure Solutions section to get you a bit extra experience on Internet of Things and artificial intelligence scenarios. So, what are we actually going to do in this third lab? Again, using the Azure subscription that we created in Lab 1, we're going to come along and create an Azure storage account. We're going to create a couple of each type of storage container within there. We're then going to download and install the Azure Storage Explorer utility onto our local machines, and we're going to get some practice creating table containers and populating with information. The same with blob storage, taking large binary large objects and placing them in there, so files, video files, and being able to retrieve them via API calls. File storage, so we'll be able to create file shares and map drives to them, and also queue storage as well, and to be able to put messages into queues so we can see what's happening there. Content delivery networks are mentioned quite a lot in both the fundamentals and the administrator exams. They don't really probe you too deep on the details around content delivery networks, but what they consistently want you to do is to prove that you understand what a CDN is, how it works, and how it can help in the solutions that you're building. That's why in the lab here, I'm going to get you to create a content delivery network and replicate some content out around the world. SQL Server Platform as a Service solves a lot of problems for developers. It gets rid of the whole I need to maintain a server operating system and a SQL instance scenario. What it does is it strips away a lot of the complexity around hosting a SQL database for us. We're going to use SQL Server Azure or Azure SQL PaaS to create a SQL database based on the Northwind Cycles sample database. It's just a small database, but it's got a lot of content in there. We're then going to use Azure SQL to replicate that instance to a couple of locations around the world, and we're then going to be able to query that database and connect to it through its database firewall. We're going to do a similar export exercise with Cosmos DB. So Cosmos DB is similar to SQL, but it also supports document database as well standards. So it's a more versatile platform for databases. Rather than storing data in structured tables, Cosmos DB can store them in XML files. That lends itself very well to replication and very cheap data storage around the world. Finally, in the labs, you're going to go through some Azure solutions. What that means is you're going to go to the Azure Solutions Catalog. You're going to take some solutions from there, read up on what they do, deploy them as a solution, which is quite simple because you're literally just going to deploy it and fill in some answers to some questions. Then you're going to get a chance to play with some of the more advanced scenarios that Azure brings us, like artificial intelligence and Internet of Things. Hopefully by going through this lab, it's going to cement the knowledge that you already have from the first two exams and make sure that you really truly conceptualize these subjects correctly. Let's take a look at the beast that is the AZ-900 exam. Now, funnily enough, the exam is called Exam AZ-900 Microsoft Azure Fundamentals. And it may surprise you to know that the technology this exam is going to test you about is Microsoft Azure. The exam is structured around 4 subject areas, and they should map to the modules that we've covered in the first 2 modules of this course. So we've got cloud concepts, core Azure services, security, privacy, compliance and trust, pricing and support. And as you can see, there's a fairly even balance of the number of questions that you're going to come up with across each of those areas. I wouldn't say there's any one of those areas where you can skimp on your learning and still expect to get passed. So make sure that you do go through each of the modules. Make sure you do each of the labs. Yeah. Make sure when you're ready to go in there, you're familiar and comfortable with those topics. There are no prerequisite qualifications you've got to have to go in and sit the AZ-900 exam. For the architect and for the DevOps expert exam, there are some prerequisites there, but not in this case. Yeah, you can go in there with nothing behind you. Prerequisite training, you don't have to have attended any official training courses or anything like that to go in there. But we'd recommend that you follow this course and you complete the associated labs to get yourself ready. But don't worry, there's no hard requirements. You don't have to produce any certificates of attendance or anything like that. This exam is going to throw approximately 40 to 60 questions at you. Now what varies there is there's usually 2 papers of the exam available. And also as well, the reason why the number of questions you might get varies is Microsoft has started putting beta questions into live exams. So when a new technology becomes available in Azure or there's been a change in the way Azure works and functions, they create new questions and they put them out there into the live pools of questions. Now don't worry, beta questions don't affect your grade or your score. Microsoft are literally putting them out there just to test the quality of them and to try and elicit some feedback on them. Yeah, so that's why you might see some questions come up and you think, well, I've never even heard of that before. That wasn't on the course. Or, do you know, I've worked with Azure for a while and I've not seen that before. It's entirely likely that could just be a beta question. To pass the exam, you need to get 70%, which means 700 points, more than 700 points in the exam. What you're going to find is that there's some weighting around some of the questions. Yeah. If there's a lab question in an exam, which there isn't in the fundamentals one, but there are in some of the subsequent Azure exams, the score there is going to be heavily weighted towards the labs, meaning if you do well in the labs, you'll do well in the exam. Also as well, where you have sort of more complex questions like drag and drop, they can have a higher number of points associated with them. Finally, you're going to get 85 minutes of actual exam answer question time in there. You'll probably be in the testing room for about 100 to 105 minutes because there's some activities you need to do at the start. So you'll need to sign into the testing machine. You'll need to sit a quick questionnaire about your previous experience and your testing experience. Then at the end, you'll be asked to feedback and provide feedback on the exam testing experience as well. So that's what the exam looks like. Now remember, this is a fundamentals exam. It's not meant to be rocket science. What you're demonstrating by sitting and passing the Azure Fundamentals exam is you know about Azure. You know the cloud concepts, you knew the core services that make up Azure, you're aware of the security, compliance and trust issues, and most importantly, you've got an understanding of pricing and support options within Azure. Here in lesson 6, we're going to take a look at some exam tricks and techniques that will hopefully help you improve your chances of success in the exam. When I sit down and talk to people who sat and passed exams and failed exams, there tends to boil down to being two categories of reason why people fail. One is preparation. They haven't done enough revision, they don't understand the subject enough, or they haven't prepared properly for being in the exam room. Hopefully by doing this course and the exercises that I'm prescribing in this course and the preparation strategy will get you ready and solve that first set of problems. The other times where people have gone wrong, it's been about execution issue things, and that's things that have gone wrong inside the exam room. They've done the prep and they've got in there and something's gone wrong. So what can we do to stop that from happening? So these questions are detailed. You might find some questions with as much as 3 or 4 paragraphs of information in there. And what's happening there is they're trying to get you to select the correct answer. Make sure you take the time to read that question fully. Consider all the nuances and consider the details that are in that question. Look at the details because that may sway you from using one solution to another solution. Probably one of the most annoying things is it's possible to read a question, look at the answers and immediately think, yep, it's that, it's definitely that, and then move on. Now, there's no harm in going back and looking at your response and double checking your thinking. But if you get into a situation where you took a look at the answer, thought, yeah, it's A, it's definitely A, I'm going to click A and I'll move on. Then you go back and you look at read the question again, you think, but is it A? Yeah, it could be A, but it could also be C as well. Yeah, maybe it's C. If you're telling yourself, maybe it's C, listen to the voice in your head. Yeah. Are you saying, yep, it's definitely C? I know that it's C. Great, go with it. But when you get into one of these situations where you're not sure, listen to your gut instinct. Yeah, go with your gut instinct. If your gut instinct says A was the first thing you chose and it stood out as being the right answer, yeah, but C feels like it might be right, trust your gut instinct. You can waste a lot of these time in exams by procrastinating. Don't let that slow you down. And do trust your gut instinct. If you look at the way the human brain works, the stuff that you really know becomes instinctive. Think about, when you look at a question, think about what knowledge the question is asking you to prove that you have. Think about this from the perspective of the exam question writer. What were they getting you to prove that you know to select the correct answer? That'll usually help bring to mind what are the pitfalls, what are the points the question's trying to make. And when you look at the questions, try and think that through. Quite often the exam questions are written to prove not just one point, but perhaps maybe several points and some subtle nuances as well. So take the time to read the question and take the time to think about what the question is really asking you to prove knowledge-wise. One of the things that really threw me when I sat my first Azure exam back in 2016 was the number of third-party technologies that were listed in the exams. And quite often, third-party technologies like GitHub, because it was a third-party technology in those days, and Coure and Linux were the right answer. You've got to remember, Microsoft no longer looks at third-party technologies like Mac, like Linux, like Java as being evil. It's entirely possible that the solution you need to build in Azure might comprise of a Linux VM, a Java runtime environment. Maybe you need to use a third-party component to complement what Azure can do for you. Again, look at what the question's asking for. Maybe it's testing your limits of the knowledge of what you can do with a Windows VM, or maybe it's looking for, how you solve a particular problem using third-party technology. Don't just assume that a third-party answer is not the correct one anymore. With the Azure exams, specifically the administration and developer exams, which are divided up into multiple sections with labs, planning your time becomes essential. It's very easy to run out of time in those exams, even though those more advanced ones are 3 hours long. You're going to have 85 minutes to sit the Azure Fundamentals exam. And in that time, you're probably going to sit between 40 and 60 questions. So take a look at how many questions you've got. Try and keep in mind how long you've got for each question. Don't feel like you've got to rush through this stuff. Don't skip on things like rereading the question and double checking the answer. Yeah, but don't procrastinate. Use your time wisely. Where you can see an answer that's a definite, yep, that's it, click it and move on. Only come back to the questions where you feel like you have got to, maybe reword it or spend a bit more time on it. Most importantly, stay frosty, stay cool, stay focused. Forget about failure. Forget about winning. Just be in the moment of every single question. Read the question. Consider the answers. Remember, you've been through this training. Remember, you know about Azure now. Yeah? Stay calm. Don't doubt yourself. Yeah? And just stay focused. In Lesson 7, let's take a look at some of the types and styles of questions that the AZ-900 exam might throw at you. Over the years, Microsoft has modified the types and styles of questions that are in their exams. When I first sat my first exams back in the NT4 days, it was basically a series of just multiple choice questions. The question styles have evolved over the years. So on the screen here, we can see some of the different types of exam questions that are on there. Now, what that means is they're going to test your knowledge by asking you to demonstrate your knowledge in slightly different styles. Let's take a look at each of these. This is a classic multiple choice question. As you can see at the top, we have the actual question section. Then underneath that, the question is asking us to select an option which is best suited to fix the problem. All we need to do is select the right answer. Now, one of the things you'll notice here about this multiple choice question is there's a radio button that's round. That means the question is expecting only one answer. There is a variable of the multiple choice question called multiple choice click all that apply, and that will be notified by there should be there's some words written in the question saying select all that apply or select all components of a complete solution. So take great care when you're looking at multiple choice questions. Watch out to see if there's a square tick box or a round radio box. A round radio box means the question is expecting one and only one answer. A square box should be a bit of a telltale that more than one of the answers could be correct. Remember that as a Microsoft certified professional at any level, even at foundations, you're expected to be a bit of an expert on the subject matter you're being certified in. That's why some of these questions use the best answer format. What the best answer means is that up here in the question, they're asking you to make a choice. And they're also they're also telling you that more than one answer choice may achieve the goal. We have to select the best answer. This is where that kind of myth about the Microsoft answer and the real world answer being available comes from. It's these sorts of questions. The trick is not to worry. That whole thing about there being a Microsoft right answer and a real world right answer is a bit of a myth. What you need to do is go in and look at the details of the question. Now, it's possible some of these potential answers will be incorrect. They won't be possible under any circumstances. But it's possible some of these answers, more than one of these answers, might give you a solution. But not that every one of these answers is going to be the optimal choice to make. So you need to be able to differentiate between multiple ways of achieving a task and knowing which is the right one based on what the question is asking you. So with these questions, make sure, like with all questions, make sure you read the question thoroughly. Make sure you consider everything the question is telling you. One of the newer, more interactive types of questions is the build list question. Here you'll be asked a question, typically to explain a process that you'd need to carry out to implement a solution or to do some sort of configuration work. Over on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see the choices of actions that you could undertake. Over on the right-hand side is the answer area. What you need to do is drag and drop the various parts of your solution and put them into the answer area. Then you have to sort them into the correct sequence of steps in which you'd follow to achieve the goal. You get 75% of the marks for getting the right objects in the answer area and 25% for getting them in the right sequence. Something to watch out for. quite often there'll be additional options put on the left-hand side that you don't even need to put into the answer. So what you've got to be able to do is describe the process you're going to go through. They're going to give you some options about what to do. Now, there are two different types of these questions. One thing to watch out for is the number of answers that the answer pane will actually accept. Quite often you can get a little bit of a heads up on the answer by making sure that if the answer is only going to accept 3 or 4 potential answers from the left-hand side, maybe that'll give you some bit of help there. Another type of interactive question is the drag and drop question. Here really you're getting 3 questions for the price of 1, but don't worry, there are more marks available for these types of questions. Here in the question section, you're being given a scenario and a task to accomplish that's going to revolve around multiple parts of a solution being configured. So what you need to do down in the answering area is select the correct response and drag it to the correct part of the answer area. You're just grabbing it and literally sliding into the area. One of the things to watch out for is sometimes we may be able to use our answer more than once. So over here, we can maybe take recycle bin and apply that to document, SharePoint, and SharePoint. Sometimes we may be only able to use our answer once. So you need to bear that in mind. Also, as well as with the previous interactive questions, they may give you more options than you actually need. So you need to identify what is the right solution here. First of all, what you've got to be able to do is in your head is understand what the answer is, then just drag and drop the relevant component across to it. This is an example of a hot area question. Basically what's happening here is in the question, they're giving you a scenario, telling you that you need to achieve some kind of configuration. Then in the bottom side of the question, you're being asked to choose where you maybe which option you select. Now, quite often you may have just one option to take or one tick box to put in place. What the exam is looking for is that you can make the right configuration selection in there. This is another example of a hot area question. In this scenario, the question has asked us to identify some folders that need to be manipulated or deleted or something. Down in the work area, we need to select the relevant folders that need to be used. All we need to do is select the right ones here. Just another example of a hot area question. All a hot area question is just a very, very basic simulation of either the console or the Azure portal, and it's asking you to select an area where you would or basically demonstrate putting the right solution in place. Repeated answer questions are still relatively new. They first really came about in the Azure exams back in September of last year. What will happen is you will be given the same scenario, effectively the same question 3 times, but there will be some subtle differences in the requirements. You'll be given probably the same set of responses. Now it may just be true and false, or it may be a selection of tools that you could use to achieve a job. The true and false ones are very popular in these Azure exams. So what they'll do is they'll ask you, can you use this technology to solve this problem? And what they'll do is they'll ask you the same question again. Right, this time, can you use this other technology to solve that problem? Then they'll ask you the question for the 3rd time. Can you use this 3rd technology to solve that problem? True or false? Now, what they do with these repeated answer questions is they lock them down into an individual section. Once you've answered one of those repeated answer questions and moved on to the next one, you can't go back and revisit the previous one. Case study questions can seem like the most complex, but in reality, they're probably one of the more simple ones. In some exams, you will receive a case study, which is where you have multiple sections that explain a customer type scenario. So there'll be things about requirements, the as-is solution, the to-be solution, different sets of requirements, and maybe a problem statement. And if there's an exhibits button, that's where we'll see things like diagrams that explain what's in place. Once you move past the case study reading material, you then move on to usually between 7 and 12 multiple choice questions about that scenario. So all the questions you're going to be asked around that will pertain to that case study. So for example, you might have a case study that says the customer has 700 servers on premises and is looking to close their data center. Then in the exam questions, it would be which of the following would you choose for their server hosting solution? Hybrid cloud, public cloud, private cloud, blah, blah, blah. So one of the personal tips I've taken is that I use, I'm not very good at speed reading case studies. You can waste a lot of time reading through every single line in every part of the case study. I tend to have a quick glance through it at the start, go to the questions, find out what the question's asking me, then I come back and then navigate my way through the case study to find out, what's the right choice for the customer. There's been an increasing trend with Microsoft to introduce beta questions into production exams. It used to be the case that if you were going to sit a beta question, you would sit a beta exam and they would validate the questions in there before they made them live. With Azure, it's very difficult for them to do that because the technology is changing constantly. The exam questions constantly change and evolve over time. What that means is they do testing in production with this exam. What you'll see typically, the AZ-900 exam, you'll see between 40 and 60 questions. What that probably means is maybe as much as a third of the questions you're facing might be beta questions about new functionality, new concepts, new ways of doing things. What that means is you might get a question that's dropped in there that hasn't been on the course, isn't been in any of the reading material, hasn't been in the labs, and it might seem like it's coming out of left field. Now, the beta questions don't actually constitute your mark. If you get a beta question wrong, you don't lose any ground with that. Yeah. So if you see a question that seems like it's completely out of the blue, don't panic. Just give the best answer you can, have a guess at it, and move on. Yeah. Like I say, there can be up to 20% of the exam questions you face could be beta questions. So don't panic when you see these questions coming up there. Best of luck in sitting and passing the AZ-900 exam.